Hi, and welcome to this lecture on ethics. The first thing I want to talk about is just what is ethics. One thing that should be pointed out is that while in some contexts, uh, ethics and morality, or ethical theory and moral theory, or the words ethical and moral, have different meanings. For example, in some contexts, in ordinary life, people use the word ethical to refer to professional guidelines, so the ethical guidelines for being a doctor, whereas moral matters deal with more personal things about how someone lives their own personal life. Um, Another way in which ordinary language sometimes makes a distinction between the two is that ethics deals with the sort of unimportant things, while morality deals with the more heavy, weighty things. There's a number of different other ways in which, across a variety of contexts, these two words end up having different meanings, which are special to the particular context. In ethical theory or moral theory, among philosophers anyway, and the way that I'll be using the two terms, they're completely synonymous, right? We'll be using the words ethics and moral, or ethical theory and moral theory, as meaning the same thing, and in particular meaning uh, trying to answer the question, what should I do? The practical question of action. Now, not practical in the sense that it's helpful, concrete, um, useful, but practical in the sense that it deals with action. It's this court dealing with ethical theory and moral theory is actually quite abstract, and its implications for everyday life and how useful it is an open question. I think that ethics can be useful. Hopefully, ethical theory will be able to apply itself, and certainly there are applied ethics courses and applied ethics textbooks, and lots of ethicists who are trying to apply it to concretely to cases. But I would hate to rush it. Getting ethical theory right, the abstract issues done first, I think, is an important part before you can move on to the concrete stuff. And this um, what's important is that we understand ethical theory or moral theory first before we try to start applying things to more concrete or specific cases. Okay. So, what is ethical theory or moral theory, now that we know that they're the same? Well, first off, they're both branches of philosophy. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what philosophy is, and then I'm going to come back and talk about uh, specifically about moral theory and ethics. So philosophy is a field of inquiry. It's trying to discover something about the world. It's doing investigations into the world, trying to collect a body of truths. So it's unlike a number of other subjects or areas of human activity, for example, drama or literature or poetry. Um, Not to denigrate those fields at all, and maybe to a certain extent they do have literature investigates how human psychology or something along those lines. But I think that a lot of those subjects, they're not really trying to just collect up a body of truths or investigate facts about the world. There's an entertainment aspect. Um, Sports would be another area of human activity, which is going to be entertainment or athletics, but not trying to necessarily discover truths about the world. So all of those subjects will be different from philosophy in that they're not trying to find something out. They're not out to discover something, which makes philosophy more like other fields of inquiry. Just to name a few other fields of inquiry, right? We have got chemistry, mathematics, biology, astrophysics, a number of fields which are trying to discover something about the world, who are trying to collect a body of truths. Of course, philosophy is not like those subjects in some sense. The key difference is that philosophy is not experimental or not empirical. So while chemists, if they're trying to discover some truth, they spend a lot of time thinking, researching, and then eventually the way they settle the issue or establish a truth is they go out and perform an experiment. They go mix a whole bunch of chemicals together, set them on fire, throw them at a wall, and see what happens, and see if it matches their expectations. So what we have with biology and chemistry and all these other scientific subjects is that they all depend very heavily on experiment. And go take any science class, they're going to be very proud about the fact that they are experimental and that their method places a prominent spot for experiments. Philosophy, of course, has no experiments. Philosophy is a field of inquiry that is not experimental. So in that respect, it's similar to mathematics. With mathematics, you don't go and perform experiments. Instead, you get a whole bunch of mathematicians in a room and give them a whole bunch of paper and you let them think about some mathematical puzzle for 3 years, and then maybe they'll come out with the answer. So Similar to philosophy, mathematics is a field of inquiry which is not experimental, or similar to mathematics, philosophy is a field which is not experimental but still a field of inquiry. That is not to say, and absolutely not to say, that philosophy is a sort of subject which you can go into a room and do by yourself for 3 years and come out with the right answer. That is absolutely the wrong way to go about it. There are many peer-reviewed, active philosophical communities where they publish, rip each other apart, pose objections to one another, have conferences with speakers where often the question and answer session the goal is to make the speaker cry. So philosophy is actually a pretty hostile discipline, maybe to its detriment, because since there's not an experiment, the arguments have to be very, very rigorous. There's no way in which, not to insult the experimental fields, but there's no way to sort of cheat around the argument and just go perform an experiment to find out the right answer. It has to be just the arguments and just objections, and that requires a real commitment to rigorous argumentation and real clear thinking and lots of input from other philosophers so that we don't end up with something that's false, an incorrect picture of the world. So that's philosophy. A couple of questions a philosopher might try handling, just to give examples other than the ones that ethics deals with. Philosopher of science deals with the proper way of investigating the world scientifically. What's the correct scientific method? Of course, that can't be settled by an experiment because the scientific method tells us how to perform experiments. So that would be a question that's not experimental, and it's a question about the world that we're interested in discovering, and that's what philosophers would deal with. And a lot of philosophers, for example, a question is, does evidence that comes in after a theory is developed count less towards the theory's truth than evidence we had before the theory was discovered? And that's a question which philosophers in science try settling. And since it's a question about how we deal with evidence, it's not a question we can solve by using evidence or experiments because we don't already know how to deal with experiments or evidence. But this question is supposed to tell us how to deal with experiments and evidence. So it's got to be non-evidential, non-empirical, or non-experimental, and that's why it falls to the philosopher of science. Another question is philosophers of metaphysicians or philosophers of mathematics would deal with questions like, what are numbers? While mathematicians try solving mathematical puzzles, I think that usually it's the philosophers who are trying to figure out what do all these mathematical truths refer to. If I say 2 and 2 is 4, I'm talking about some number 2 and some numbers 4 and how they relate to one another. But of course we might ask, well, where are these numbers? Clearly that's an absurd question, but they're clearly a part of our world in a way which fictional characters are not. Sherlock Holmes is not a part of our world, whereas, or at least a part of our world in a different way than 2 is, but they're both not physically a part of our world. Tables, on the other hand, are very, very much physically a part of our world. So metaphysicians would be dealing with questions like that, questions about types of ways of existing, and some of them are physical ways of existing. Some things are part of our universe in a non-physical way, like numbers and fictional characters and possibilities and properties like red. All of these, while there's each instantiation of red might be is at a particular time and a particular location, red, the unifying thing that they all share, that's clearly not a physical thing. I can't go destroy red. I can go destroy particular instances of red, but not redness itself. So those are also questions which philosophers try struggling with. So what about ethics or moral theory? What question are they trying to solve? Well, they're trying to do inquiry. We already know that because it's a field of philosophy, and we know it's not going to be empirical. And I think I already gave a hint at the beginning of the lecture, which is they're interested in action, and particularly how we should act, or how the world should be. So it's what we would call a normative rather than descriptive, because it's focused on directing us towards how we should act, rather than just telling us how we do act. Clearly that can't be settled by an experiment or any sort of investigation, because I can go check how people do act, but that doesn't tell me how they should act. Maybe they're all horrible people. So maybe we all lie, cheat, and steal, and that's how we do act, and a sociologist might come and tell us that. But the ethicist isn't concerned with that. The ethicist is concerned with how they should act.